I apologize we've not been able to get the video to play for e-learning day. I'm going to try recording it one more time, but I will give you tomorrow's class to take the notes because that is my fault that it wasn't working correctly. I guess it would not load to YouTube. So our third day of notes for our chapter 1, lesson 1 on in understanding the diversity of living things. All right, so we're going to continue on picking up with pseudoscience of spontaneous generation where we left off in class, and then look at all the things that living things must have in common, introduce you to some extra vocabulary words that you need to know, and then we will finish up with reviewing homeostasis. So once again, we have talked about for quite some time, since before Christmas break, the difference between living and non-living, biotic versus abiotic. And we talked about how there are 6 things that all living things must have in common, starting with the idea that they all have cells. And then we said inside those cells, there were 5 different main chemicals that you can find inside of every single type of cell. And then inside the cells also, you'll see them be able to use metabolism to do the things that the organism needs in order to survive. Those 3 things, unless you are highly skilled and trained and you have the equipment, we can't really see. Excuse me. But the other 3, we know as we continue on with the group, we can see. It will respond to a stimulus. And we said a stimulus is the outside part that's changing around it. The response is therefore the reaction of the living organism to that stimulus. The 5th one was the idea that it will grow and develop, with growth being getting larger as time goes along, and development means to change over a period of time. And then the 6th one was that they will be able to reproduce. They will either be asexual, and they'll be able to split and duplicate themselves, basically cloning themselves over and over again, or they will be sexual reproducers where they have the genes for the female and the genes for the male, and they will be able to mix together to create something new. Then we went on into the idea of the scientific method and looking at this pseudoscience known as spontaneous generation. We said there was Francisco Redi, and he did an experiment using meat and containers, and then he did it multiple times over a couple of years span, taking notes and being very detailed. Because up to this point, people just saw that flies were developing on top of dead and decaying food. And so they've just assumed that we had flies that would come and out of non-living things. Through this experiment, then, we know we have 3 different steps that we need to have in our experiment. So we have our control variables, we have our dependent or our responding variables, and we have our independent, also known as the manipulated variables. The controls is everything in an experiment that must stay the same. The independent or the manipulated is the one thing that we're changing. And Francisco Redi changed the exposure to the air. The first one being corked and sealed, so it was under control. The gauze allowed air to go in and out, but nothing else. And then just open air in the jar. And so the dependent variable, the responding variable, was the idea that maggots would form on top of the gauze, not touching the meat, and then on the meat because the flies could get down to the meat. So then we looked at answering these questions. In that example, the manipulated variable was what? That's the exposure to air. It was either sealed, it was covered, or it was uncovered. The responding variable or the dependent was, are there maggots at the end or are there not maggots at the end? And then the third question is, what are 2 constants? And I gave you several different ones, but you need to write down 2 of them in your note packet. Same location, same type of jar, same kind of meat, same amount of time. Excuse me, sorry. So now we have to look at how long it takes for this idea that San Frisco Redi said in 1668, spontaneous generation is not real. Well, we're talking about a long period of time, almost 200 years. In 1859, a scientist over in Europe did some more tests and publicized, but he was a well-known scientist. And it took that long before he began to publish what he declared as the proof that spontaneous generation does not exist. So let's look at what's happening during that time, because we have a hard time imagining things outside of our own country and our own world. That's basic life. So in 1668, when Francisco Redi had discovered that spontaneous generation cannot happen, that flies do not come from dead and decaying material, right? We were not yet a country. We were not a country until 1776. Now, there were people here, right? We had our colonies, the Pilgrims came and landed. We had our first few states on the East Coast, but we were referred to as New England. As time begins to pass, it's not until 1803, so 1776, we sign the Declaration of Independence, we declare our own nation, and then it takes about 30 years before we start to expand. We bought a couple large chunks of land, Ohio and Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And then we've started buying up more and more and more and more land. So all of this land was purchased in these different sections before it got publicized in Europe. The spontaneous generation does not exist. We had 48 states in our country before we heard the news that spontaneous generation does not exist. We only had 2 states that we added after that point, and that was Alaska and Hawaii. Those happened in the later parts of the 1800s. So up to this point, everyone in this country, in what we call the continental United States, still believed that spontaneous generation happened, that living things comes from dead, decaying, and non-living material. So in 1859, we have a scientist in Europe who had been doing some studies on this process that he called pasteurization. He called it pasteurization because his name was Louis Pasteur. It was not something that people commonly did, right? If you wanted to get something to drink and you didn't have running water, which at the time they didn't, they went down to the creek, they poured it in their cup, and they drank it. They didn't know about things and small particles and living organisms that were going to be inside the water that are microscopic that could really make them sick. They didn't know about viruses and bacterium that could really make them sick. So he had already been doing some tests with boiling liquids, such as soup. So he used broth. And broth is when I take meat and bones and I start boiling them all together, and then I take all of the chunky stuff out, what's left, what we call soup or broth, that's what a beef broth is. So he made beef broth, and he put both of the particles inside of a container. One of them had what's called a gooseneck valve, which didn't let air flow into it because of the natural curve of the glass, but the gases could escape. And then he had one where he just had an open valve. There wasn't anything to prevent the gases from going in and out. So when we looked at what was going to happen then, the beef broth with the gooseneck tubing on it, nothing changed. It just was beef broth that began to decay because of the natural material that was in it, but nothing else formed. It wasn't like clumpy and glunky and gross and slimy, where the one that was exposed to the air, it began to grow things like mold and funguses, right? It became gross and slimy. And what he found out is that these particles are outside in the air and they land inside of things like the liquids, and then they begin to grow because they have a place that can expand and feed and multiply. And so he proved that from this boiling process where all impurities are cooked out and not giving it any access from the natural air and surroundings around it, then we have no living things that happen. But when it's exposed to air and other organisms, then we can have other living things that begin to grow inside of that jar. And so he published in the 1800s that spontaneous generation is not a thing. When we look at scientists today, we can still ask them the same type of question because they believe, or they will talk about the scientific theory that there have been all these particles and energies and all of these things out in the space, in the galaxies and universes that were not living. And then bing, bang, boom, gravity happened and there was an explosion. And then for billions of years, these planets were there. And then suddenly a living cell happened. But when you ask them how that can happen, if living things do not come from dead, decaying, non-living things, they don't know. But they will tell you if you ask them, is spontaneous generation a science? Is it real? No, it's a pseudoscience. So when we look at those kind of things then on page 10, filling in our questions, understanding science, and we're going to get a lot more into the scientific method when we get beyond our ecology study. So the something is the factor that changes. So we go to those three parts, right? So we have the independent, the dependent, and the manipulated variable. The thing that changes is the manipulated variable. We have to change one thing for a scientific experiment to work correctly, and then everything else must be controlled, must be left alone. When we look at the second question and it asks why is spontaneous generation incorrect, it's because it's been proven. It has been proven scientifically for past couple hundred years that we cannot get something living from something that is not living. So now we get into the last part of the section of notes. So what do living things have in common then? So what are we talking about when we're talking about living things, right? So we're talking about plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, protists. They all need food. Every plant and every animal needs food. It doesn't matter if it's microscopic. It doesn't matter if it's a blue whale. So when we talk about plants that make their own food, we've talked about producers. We also need to understand the word autotrophs, and that's in your packet. So an autotroph is a producer. So when it says auto, it means automatic. Troph, food. So these are organisms, plants. They have chlorophyll, they have chloroplast, they mix carbon dioxide and sunlight and water, and they make oxygen and glucose. We've talked about all of that for producers. So autotrophs and producers are the same thing. Those are plants. Everything else kind of goes into the other category, and that's called a heterotroph, which is also in your packet. Make sure you're marking it, writing it down, taking notes on it. A heterotroph is what you and I are. We are a consumer. So I agree that the terms producers and consumers are easier, but there are specific scientific terms for them. Heterotrophs are the consumers. They are anything that must eat another organism or organisms in order to survive. They are not plants. They do not have chlorophyll. They cannot create their own food using sunlight. So we have one category, plants that are autotrophs that create their own food that are producers. Everything else, protists, bacteria, fungi, and animals, they're all consumers. They are all heterotrophs. Not only do all living organisms need food, all living organisms need water. We do not know of a living creature from a bacterium to a blue whale that can survive without water. Yes, some organisms can go a longer period of time without water. However, water is still required. 97% of all water on our planet is salt water. We can't use it. Now, other animals can, yes, but you and I can't. So that tells us that we only have 3% of all the water on our planet that is usable water for us to drink. It's found in the ice, and it's found in lakes. It's found in some seas, freshwater seas, and a lot of it we get in this area from underground, which is known as an aquifer. Water is essential for living things. All living things that we know of up to date must have water and food in order to survive. The third main thing that all living things need is a habitat. They need some place to live. They need their own living space. You and I have a home, right? I don't think any of you live in a cave or, underground somewhere. So we all have a home. However, the home for other living organisms does look different depending on the organism that they are and what habitat they live in. But all of these different biomes that we talked about, right? All these different ecosystems, is their home. It's their habitat. They need their own living space. The last thing that they all have in common is all living things have this thing that we need to review known as homeostasis. And homeostasis just means it is balanced. If it's balanced, that means it's healthy. It has the food it needs, it has the water it needs, it has the space it needs to live in. And when it comes to you and I, we know that we are physically healthy, we are mentally healthy, we are emotionally healthy. We have all the food, water, and supplies that we need in order to stay healthy. Our homeostasis means our body temperature is an average of 98.6. We are the height that we're supposed to be. We're the size we're supposed to be. We can go, out and do some exercise or some manual labor and not fall over and faint because we can't get our breath. Right? So homeostasis means that our body is healthy and we're able to maintain that. So in your last section where you're going to take notes, which basic need is a fox meeting by feeding on berries? So to have those 4 different ones, right? So food, water, shelter, and homeostasis. Well, easy enough. It's getting its own food. 3B says the Arctic fox has thick, dense fur in the winter and much shorter fur in the summer. How does this help the fox maintain homeostasis? So this has a 2-part answer to it. The first one, in the winter, when the habitat becomes cold, where it lives becomes cold, the fox must grow additional fur to stay warm and maintain its homeostasis. However, when it begins to warm up, if it kept all that fur, it's going to get too hot, right? And so it has to be able to cool down. So the fox sheds off that thick winter fur and stays cooler in the summertime and is able to continue to maintain its homeostasis. Once again, I apologize if this did not work. I will give you tomorrow's class to finish taking your notes, and then Friday you can do your assignment, and we will be good to go into next week. So if you do have any questions, if there are any more problems with this video, please just let me know.